Welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. Today we have the privilege of welcoming Professor Michael Useem, our distinguished guest on the podcast. Professor Michael is the William and Jacalyn Egan Emeritus Professor of Management and the Faculty Director of both the Center for Leadership and Change Management and the McNulty Leadership Program at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Useem is a leading authority on leadership and governance. He has taught and advised executives across US, Asia, Europe, and Latin America. Author of acclaimed books such as The Leadership Movement and The Leader's Checklist. Professor Useem has shaped how leaders navigate change, crisis, and strategy worldwide. In today's episode, Professor Michael Useem joins us to share powerful insights from his acclaimed book, The Leader's Checklist, 16 Mission Critical Principles. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Useem to the conversation. Professor Useem, we are deeply honored by your presence and truly grateful for your time with us today, especially as this marks your third appearance on our podcast.
So Deepak, thank you very much on that. It is my privilege to have this dialogue with you. So I feel honored to be invited to have this dialogue on the future of leadership, especially in and around a leader's checklist. My privilege to be here.
Thank you. Professor, the book opens with a compelling scenarios of Denise Ramos being asked to lead one of ITT's spin-off despite being a CFO, not a CEO. You quote the board chair saying she had been CEO before she was CEO. What does it mean to think and act like a CEO before holding the title? And how can mid-level managers cultivate this mindset in their current roles?
So Deepak, it's a really good illustration to focus on. Denise Ramos, who had come out of Purdue University, one of America's great engineering, best known for its engineering universities based in Indiana. And then she then she secured an MBA degree with a focus on finance. And as she worked her way up the corporate ladder at several very large companies, it was always in the finance function. And then at ITT, one of America's legendary, originally extremely diverse companies, less so in more recent years, she became chief financial officer. Because the company was fairly diverse in its operations, the board of directors and top management decided to break up the company into three separate, call them spin-offs, independently owned and managed companies. And the chair of the board of directors called up Denise, the chief financial officer now for the company, before it was broken up. And he said, Denise, we'd like you to become CEO of one of the three independent spinoffs. And she said, very briefly, I've talked with her at length about this. She said to the chair of the board that you report to, because keeping that in mind, but why me? I'm a finance person, and you want somebody who can run a company that can think about finance and operations and marketing and accounting and a whole bunch of topics that are not finance. The board chair said, Denise, thank you for telling me what I know about you already, but the board has decided to go with you as the CEO of one of these three now to be independent spinoffs because you're already thinking like a CEO. And she says, well, what exactly does that mean? And the board chair said, Denise, when we would meet with you, you were at the board meetings, typically as chief financial officer. You talked not only about the cash that was in and the demands on the budget in this coming year, but you also would work with us on the board on how to use the cash. Strategically, where was the cash best put? Where were the opportunities to grow value? Where were the potential pitfalls that would lead us to lose value? And thus, you were really thinking about the company not just as a chief financial officer, but as a general manager. You were thinking of where are the opportunities for growth? Do we have the personnel? It's an HR question, not in her portfolio, at least so she thought. Do we have the people to run the company if we expand into a new area and all that? Quick summary, just to put it then in a phrase. that, and this then is part of the broader leaders checklist, to think like a person who's in a higher position than you. If you're CFO, many of us hope to get there, of course, not myself, but many of the people probably taking this in, really important to not only get your job done, that's obvious, but to think about what you should be thinking about if you were to hold the next higher position. In other words, think like a CEO, or at least think like a person who's the next rung or two up above you. What would the powers that be, people way above you, want you to be debating or considering in your mind at that higher level, even if you're not there yet? Just to put it in a phrase, it's very good to think like a CEO before you are a CEO. Or if you're thinking about a nation, good to imagine that you're a cabinet minister, or maybe even a prime minister in the case of India. We will not get there, but in thinking about the future of the country, or the future of a state in India, for example, or a state here, it's very good if you're in public service, maybe working for the state I live in now, Virginia, part of the US here, to think as if you are that top person, even though you're not, and then thinking from that higher position, thinking as if you're in that higher position, track back or trace back what that implies for doing what you're doing right now. So think like a CEO, think like a country premier or president, and then take that thinking back to what you do now to shape indeed what you're doing so that it serves the greater good. So Deepak, sorry to go on so long. It's a very good question to start with.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, your 16 principles begin with articulate a vision and think strategically. In today's volatile business environment, where pivots happen rapidly, how should leaders balance the need for a compelling long-term vision with the agility to adapt when circumstances demand fundamental strategic shifts?
So let's see. Thinking strategically, at least in my humble opinion, from looking at many people, talking with many people in actually several different countries, including India and the US, Japan, China, and beyond, thinking strategically is pretty obvious when I say this. One of the most important items on my leaders checklist. Thinking strategically, seeing what's coming around the corner, appreciating if you push over here on the left side, what's going to happen on the right side. If you invest in a startup area, what are the implications for the lack of cash to invest in other areas? In other words, thinking strategically is one of the, in my view, one of the fundamental foundations on anybody's leader's checklist. Think strategically, think ahead, look around corners, appreciate how the world is changing before it changes, getting on top of things before you really have to make a decision. For strengthening that capacity, that leadership capacity, think strategically, really important in my view, from having, again, spent time with a lot of people who have risen to think more strategically. They were promoted for that reason. It's really important, my view, to just simply tell yourself you're not at a strategic level, but if you were to get there at your enterprise, what should you be thinking? To intensify your ability to do that, really important. Again, my view from talking with many people, really important to have a significant other, somebody maybe in the company to whom you can turn for guidance on becoming more strategic in thought. It's also important, I'll stop on this, to become a student of leadership, in the sense that it's worth looking at the president in our case, or the prime minister of India. How are they making decisions? What goes into the decisions? And thus look at your own setting, but look well beyond, and have a guide, a guru, a mentor, a coach in your own setting, but also become a student of the universe we live in, by looking at others, how are they thinking strategically or sometimes not, and making that very personal in its implications. In light of what you've seen somewhere else, where somebody maybe thought exceptionally strategically, let's say they could see AI coming on before anybody else, what was it that allowed them to be more savvy about AI before it suddenly hit our doorstep and we had to really work on it? So anyway, back to you, Deepak. Thinking strategically, one of the absolute foundations for anybody's checklist.
Professor, you emphasize act decisively as a mission critical principle. Yet, many leaders struggle with what you and Professor Jeffrey prefer call the knowing doing gap. Knowing what should be done but failing to implement it. What are the most common psychological barriers that prevent leaders from translating knowledge into decisive action, especially during crisis?
It's a really good issue to focus on because I think that for me anyway, one of the biggest barriers for people who are at whatever level of the enterprise or whatever the type of enterprise or whatever the country for that matter, I think one of the biggest barriers that prevent them from effectively leading, learning to lead, taking on leadership roles is knowing but not doing. And as an academic, that's sort of my profession. We need to know a lot of things about how the world works, but as academics, we're not expected to actually be part of the world that we study. But if you're in an enterprise, a public agency, a foundation, a hospital, a firefighting unit, whatever it may be, really important to tell yourself, this is a very self-directed leadership checklist item, to tell yourself to come to understand the world through a coach, a mentor, through programs, through direct experience, and then tell yourself, it's an existential statement, that it's not enough just to know what's a good tactic or a good method or a good strategy. It's not, if you're on a board of directors, it's not enough to know what good directors should be doing. You've got to tell yourself, you personally have to do it. So converting, this is the knowing doing gap that Jeffrey Pfeffer of Stanford University has co-written a great book on with one of his colleagues. The knowing doing gap, widespread but overcomable, and this is the essence of the leader's checklist, by having one item on that checklist. Don't forget to educate yourself on what you should be doing and then do it. My phrase to capture that a little bit more briefly or maybe more succinctly is take charge even if you're not fully and formally in charge. And then implicit right there is take action to make a difference when you can see the difference. And I add on this, even if you're not fully and formally in charge, as a reference to the fact that sometimes we see what should be done and we think it's somebody else's obligation to do that. Bringing this all the way back home, very important to see what should be done and then do it. Take charge, even if you're not fully and formally in charge. Close that knowing doing gap.
Professor, the book contrasts AIG's catastrophic failure during the 2008 financial crisis with more successful crisis responses. What specific leadership behavior or blind spot caused AIG's executives to be so tone deaf to warning signs? And what checklist items might have prevented this collapse?
So the AIG case, which I describe at some length in the book, American International Group, one of the world's largest insurance companies, had an operation based in London that provided insurance for those that were taking out very large positions, for example, in subprime mortgages in housing in the U.S. In the what's sometimes referred to now as the global financial crisis of 2008-09, AIG, triple A rating by the rating agencies, had developed a very large practice of providing insurance for subprime mortgage loans. If you are AAA rated at the time, it meant you did not have cash in reserve to pay off defaults because you were rated at the top of the um, rating scheme, and therefore you did not have to have reserves because the presumption was you would never have to go deeply into your reserves. So far, so good. But in the fall of '08, Lehman Brothers failed, of course, and there was a bit of a buildup to that, and then a catastrophic consequence for countries all over the world after Lehman failed. Within 24 hours, one of America's greatest brokerage firms, Merrill Lynch, failed. And in those days, those crisis days, in September 2008, AIG nearly failed itself. It would have been catastrophic. It's one of the world's largest insurance companies at the moment if it had failed. And the crisis was avoidable if top management had been indeed given to all the principles of great management at the top, including risk management. And it's an item I would add to anybody's checklist now, and that is to be thinking about upside risk, which you can do if you take a risk, but equally downside risk. What happens if things go very badly? Which is what did happen to AIG in the wake of the failure of Lehman Brothers in the U.S. in September 2008. The top executive, the CEO of the firm, did not know much about the London operation and had not sought to educate himself on what the business model was, what kind of risks were being encumbered, despite warnings from several outside agencies, including a U.S. overseer of AIG. The overseer, the regulator is a better word for that. The regulator said that this unit in London was taking very large, risky positions, and you ought to be more focused and more concerned about that. Several other warnings had come in for somebody in a position of responsibility, mindful of the leader's checklist, be savvy about risk. Despite the warnings and despite the risks that were being taken, the Home Office based in New York did not intervene. And when things suddenly, in the wake of the failure of Lehman Brothers, began to go, as we would say, began to go south, putting at risk many of the assets of AIG, the company was not prepared, either in its operation in London or in its home office in New York, to avert a near catastrophic consequence that led the U.S. government to provide for a bailout of AIG, the largest bailout ever in world history of a company. That's a long-winded way of saying, Deepak, that on anybody's checklist should be some concern about upside risks. What can we do to take a risk and incorporate artificial intelligence, for example, into our operating methods, but also to be concerned about downside risk, to be savvy about it. And if you're in a leadership position, just to sum up the main point, one of your callings is to think about risk, to understand it, to mitigate it as necessary, and to ensure that risk never puts at risk, or the ultimate risk, the company itself, as happened at AIG. Let me stop on that, Deepak.
Professor, honor the room is one of your most distinctive principles expressing confidence in and support for your team. In an era of remote and hybrid work where physical presence is limited, how can leaders effectively honor the room and build trust when they are not actually in the room with their people?
A great topic to dwell on because, in my opinion, and from my research experience, the failure to honor the room is more complained about by people who are reporting to a top executive as missing in action. And the flip side of that is if we do honor the room, the results can be dramatically affirmative. So just to dwell for a second on honoring the room and then coming to the world of remote work that we all do some of our work in almost regardless of company or country. Honoring the room is the act of helping people who work for you understand that what they're doing is important to the enterprise and that they have your attention and they have your respect. Honor the room. Many kind of almost micro ways to express that, but I did follow one executive of a very large U.S. insurance company as she walked around the building where the home office building. And I did note that she, even though she was a top executive, very well known within the US, that when she would see anybody in the hallway or in a staircase or even in an elevator, which can make for challenging a challenge to what I'm about to say, she would stop, she would take a couple seconds, maybe even a minute or two to talk to the person. Well, that was one person out of 19,000, but the word began to get around the company that the chief executive actually will stop in the hallway or sit down with us at lunch. I've never met a CEO before, but this person came up and said, I see there's a spare chair at the table. Do you mind if I join you? You being the lower level employees. So honoring the room is creating a sense that you understand who is working for you and they understand you understand that, and that you also understand how important they are to getting the job done of the company. So to make it very, maybe too simple, telling people as often as you can that their role at the company, even if it's a much lower in the hierarchy role, is really important for achieving the end of quarter results, for example. Telling them that you know them personally, if you do, or you at least know them in some way. Tougher to do that when we are in a two-dimensional medium like right now than in three dimensions in person. So simply put, taking time in a Teams call, a Zoom call, whatever the platform may be, to at least do in two dimensions what we should be doing if we honor the room in three dimensions. Knowing the person's name, a little bit about the person's background, taking a couple seconds or maybe even a couple minutes at the outset before we get into business, just asking people, since we're coming off now a major holiday here in much of the world, the new year, asking people before we talk about earnings per share to say a little bit about what they did over New Year's. Were they with family, with friends? What has that got to do with the earnings per quarter? Not a lot. What does that have to do with leading those that work with you to deliver those earnings at the end of the quarter? A whole lot. So when we're in two dimensions, don't forget to honor the room and use to the best of our ability the fact that it can be interactive, even with 300 people. And I've done some webinars like this with many hundreds. There are ways to try to personalize and honor the room.
Professor, you dedicate a principle to convey your character through storytelling and authentic self-revelation. Many leaders fear that showing vulnerability might undermine their authority. How can leaders strike the right balance between demonstrating strength and revealing their humanity, doubts, and learning moments?
You know, it's a really important facet of the leader's checklist, right up there with two or three others, honor the room being one of those, that I've noted are too often underappreciated by those who are leading. And so, just to maybe put a couple more generic words in front of us here, it is amazing, but it is true that people who work for you want to know not only the fact that you were, in the case of Denise Ramos, you were the chief financial officer. They really want to know more about you than that. Uh, do you have a family? Did you go to, I'll make it India here. Have you ever been to Kashmir? Um, they want to know maybe what your favorite music is, or what opera do you like, for example, or what rock group is your favorite rock singer. Again, on the face of it, what has this got to do with getting the results done, say, at a big company like one of the Tata Son and Sons enterprises in India, Tata Motors, for example? And the answer is it's got a lot to do with people's willingness to work hard for you. If they know more about your character, they know more about what bringing that back to them, they've got more motivation to do a great job understanding that you're a person just like them. It's something about that. That raises the question then of how you communicate your character. And you mentioned this storytelling, a little bit of an account, something that happened to you that's relevant, that makes a bigger point, is all part of the story. But to make it very tangible, I one time saw the then Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, at an event. She's on stage. There were 1,000 people in the room. And instead of sticking behind the lectern, she had a microphone and a lectern and prepared notes. She said, let me just take a minute to tell you a little bit about me. At which point she walked close to the front of the stage, got away from the lectern. She's personalizing. And she said, I grew up in an area about 100 kilometers north of Berlin. My first reaction is, what does this have to do with the future of the European Union, or the future of Germany for that matter? But then she said, if you recall the map of Germany some years ago when I was a young girl, 100 kilometers north of Berlin put me in East Germany, the German Democratic Republic. And in that era, there was no money for startups, no free movement of labor. And I've got to tell you here, standing on this stage, I want more free movement of labor throughout the EU. I want more sources of cash, like in Silicon Valley for startups. We don't have anything analogous to the Valley here in Germany. And in saying something about her childhood, I have to say, I'll make it personal. I remember more about what she said than if she had said it just in a cold, more analytic fashion. Storytelling about yourself, something brief, don't overdo it. People don't want to know your resume, but they do want to know something about your character. Really good idea, thus, to learn how to communicate your character.
Professor Virginia Rometty's $34 billion acquisition of Red Hat to pivot IBM toward hybrid cloud computing is featured as a transformational leadership case. What elements of your checklist were most critical to her successfully integrating such a massive acquisition and fundamentally reposition a 100-year-old technology giant?
So this is an account of IBM, America's original technology company. We don't think of it quite the same way we do now. When we say, let's think about the technology sector, we tend to think about Google and Meta and so on, and some of the chip makers. IBM, though, is the original technology company. It had fallen behind, though, in pushing services into the web. So Amazon was up around 25% of the web market, still is. IBM was, I think it's 6 or 7% of the web computing market at the time. That Virginia Rometty, an engineer from Northwestern University, who had become CEO, and I'll come back to that point in just a second, she said, we've been trying to build cloud computing as one of our services. We failed. So you know the mantra, if you can't build it, buy it. So she offered a company many people have never heard of called Red Hat, which had about 15,000 employees at the time, based in a southern state. IBM is based in New York, a northern U.S. state. So kind of a different world where Red Hat was located. Virginia Rometty offered a very good price, one of the extremely good price, not a price, just an offer of cash to buy Red Hat and make it part of IBM. Red Hat accepted, but then she immediately, even though she was an engineer from Northwestern, she'd become a student of leadership. She'd become a student of communicating your character. She'd become a student of thinking strategically. She went down to the southern U.S. state to meet many of the people there that she had acquired through this buyout, knowing full well that most of the people working at Red Hat probably did not want to move to New York, a northern US state. If they had a choice in the matter, maybe they wanted to go to, let's make a Google or Alphabet, which had more analogous kind of tech credentials to the company they were working with. And so vital for Virginia Rometty, that's the name of the CEO, who had begun as an engineer, who, by the way, was a great learner. And in her career at IBM, I want to come back to just stress this as a side note. She repeatedly said, I don't know a thing about marketing computers when she joined IBM. I know how they work. I don't know how to sell them. So she went to her boss and said, I want to go into the marketing function. Or then IBM also became a major source of consultation services. And she said, I didn't take a single course in Northwestern on consulting, but I want to learn how that's done. In time, kind of like Denise Ramos, Virginia Rometty became chief executive in a couple years to the run up of the acquisition of Red Hat. To finish that off and come back to the main point, and it's a bigger point that really illustrates what it means to lead, and that is there's no one thing that's going to assure your leadership. You need to think strategically. You need to act decisively. That was the case here. You need to communicate persuasively. And in my humble opinion, I've got 14 or 15 other items on the leader's checklist. You need to master them all. You need to apply them all, even if you began with none or even one or two of those. The leader's checklist is, let's call it a mission critical checklist. It's a set of items, all of them needed. And so to get back to the main issue here, when Virginia Rometty sought to bring Red Hat into the IBM family, and by the way, she succeeded, she made a point to communicate her character. She made a point to talk about the strategy and how Red Hat would become part of the IBM family. In other words, without using it self-consciously, she had a leader's checklist that was not one or two items, but was a number of items that led to the successful acquisition of Red Hat by IBM. Testimony, and I'll stop on this, testimony to the fact that no one thing on your checklist, deciding decisively or taking charge, making change, all that kind of thing, no one thing will do it. We need them all, and they're all mission critical.
Professor, your 16th principle addresses placing common interests first over personal gain. In practice, how do leaders navigate situations where short-term shareholder pressures, executive compensation structures, or competitive dynamics create powerful incentives that conflict with long-term collective good?
It's again a really important and maybe one of the most fundamental principles on the leader's checklist, again, in my humble opinion, and that is you're appointed to a position of responsibility. You've been brought up through the ranks. You have become, if it's the public sector in say, the US, you've become a ranking public official for a state or maybe even the country, or wherever it may be. And it's really important, my opinion, yet again here, based on research and observation of people like those who are probably tuning into this particular broadcast, really important to remember, it's the obvious point, that they put you there not to give you a good salary. They put you in a position of responsibility to get things done on behalf of the investors, the owners, the clients, the customers. And this is the fundamental, almost axial theme that runs through one of the most widely selling books ever in the leadership terrain. Many people will know the name as soon as I say it. It's Good to Great by Jim Collins, the great American writer. And he says, with great evidence, by comparing 10 companies that went from good to great with 10 that didn't go from good to great, that one of the most important elements was the abiding commitment by the top person to focus on what the owners or customers or investors wanted. And it's not about them, it's about those that they're serving. And again, that's not a skill set we start with. We're not born given to that. That's one thing we learn along the way. And it comes coming back to your question now, it's especially critical to keep that in mind when payday is coming. That is, you personally would like to have as large a salary as you're able to negotiate, but you also need to make certain that that salary is commensurate and is fairly premised around delivering value, not to yourself, but delivering value to the customers or the clients, or the owners or the investors. So the calling there is to not think about yourself, but to think about the ultimate purpose that you're serving, and to then encourage maybe it's the compensation committee of the board of directors or the top HR people at the company, if you're in a senior position, to make certain that you are compensated in a way that is fair to the customers or clients and is concerned, as they are concerned, with not just this quarter, not just this year, but at least 3 or 4 years out. If it's not so much a customer, but certainly an investor. Some investors, of course, are very short term. Lots here in the US will move their assets around within 12 months. But for longer term investors, they are, for example, index investors, to use that phrase from institutional investing here in the US, if they're investing in the index, which includes American Express and GE, all of America's largest companies, many countries have a similar index. They are there not for the quarter, not for the year. They are there in some cases forever. And since they are ultimately the ultimate arbiter of, they're the ultimate source of cash that you're using, you owe it to them to think long term. Not a natural skill set, it's a learned skill set, but it's a vital skill set.
Professor, build leadership in others is essential to your checklist. Yet, succession planning often fails because current leaders struggle to sedate control or adequately prepare successors. What specific practices have you observed in leaders who successfully develop and transition leadership to the next generation without creating organizational disruption?
So Deepak, I'm going to be very brief here because I know we're running out of time, but number one on that list, especially relevant to the board of directors, is to make succession planning part of what the board agenda, the board docket is concerned with. So making it explicit. And by the way, some people serving on boards are not familiar with that. But that's the essence of leadership. If you're not familiar with something you need to be familiar with, let's go out and learn about. Talk to other board members, talk to people who serve on what's usually called the Nominations and Governance Committee, most concerned at the board level with successors. But then to make it very tangible, to go inside the firm, I'm going to reference, I think for me personally, the most persuasive tactic for executive succession. And it comes from my many discussions with the chief executive of a very large US pharmaceutical maker. And his company was divided into a number of separate profit and loss units they called companies. So there were many companies within this broader corporation or company. And he said that when it came to picking the chief executive of these operating units, these companies with profit and loss responsibility that ultimately reported up to the corporate master, the finalist candidates, 2 or 3 typically being considered, would come into this CEO's office and he would take a period to talk with them and then recommend which of the 2 or 3 would become the next chief executive of these separate operating units. By the way, some of which were huge, billions of dollars of revenue, for example. And he said for him, the best question that he would ask is the following, which kind of wraps up what we've been talking about on the leaders checklist. He would ask the 2 to 3 finalists to name somebody inside the operating company whose leadership skill set the candidate had significantly enhanced. And then implicit in that was the notion that the CEO of the whole corporation was going to call up the two or three people that were identified and ask them to single out how this person under consideration to become CEO of an operating company had strengthened their leadership. What kind of coaching, what kind of mentoring, and that's I guess, a long-winded way of my saying that when it comes to executive succession within the corporate ranks, at the board level, it's a different issue, but within the board, really important to think about who's going to be a successor, to develop the candidates who could be a successor for whatever unit lies below your your pay grade. So, and I say that as a way of kind of summing up what we've been talking about. Leadership is not a natural skill set. None of us, with a few exceptions, are natural born leaders. Maybe Nelson Mandela was a natural born leader. He just seemed to have, or Mother Teresa, person also of great note. But for just about everybody out there, we're not born leaders. We learn to lead. And the most important calling of anybody in a position of responsibility is to ensure that people who are coming up reporting to you are ready to lead when they are called to do so.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with our last question. The book's 10th anniversary edition adds a 16th principle to your original 15. Looking ahead to the next decade of leadership challenges, from AI to climate pressures to geopolitical uncertainty, if you were to write a 20th anniversary edition, what new principle might you consider adding to the checklist and why?
So Deepak, I think you've already answered my answer. And it's almost a no-brainer to say right now, given the impact of artificial intelligence on everybody, including university teachers. I can't even begin to describe how extensive discussions have been within my university in the last year on how to more actively use AI in the classroom, in learning, and beyond. So I would say, in addition to the 16 principles, the 16th most important, think like a CEO, even if you're not a CEO. I think understanding this new technology, even if you're not a technologist, and nobody until maybe those coming out of the universities in the last year or two are dramatically up to speed on AI. We're all having to learn it, and that's going to be one of the great skill sets that you as a leader need to incorporate yourself, but maybe more importantly, help other people around you acquire. But lest I leave off another equally important element, it indirectly is in reference to what you've said about climate and sustainability. I think increasingly companies appreciate, major nonprofits appreciate that they are citizens of the world. So they may be based in Shanghai, they may be based in Mumbai, they may be based in New York, but the concerns that anybody at the top of those companies in a leadership position will have become much more complex with globalization and issues of climate change. And so, therefore, I would put in the little numbering system I've used in the book, number 17 is getting on top of AI and all of its ramifications as a leader. So it's not just knowing it technically, but you need to know how to lead people into its use and well beyond. And then number 2, appreciating, understanding, and then acting on the fact that you are a global citizen, and you thus need to know how the globe is faring in terms of weather, in climate, in conflict, in some of the events of recent origin that involve changes of regimes, because your company, your leadership is going to inevitably require strategic thinking about all the above.
Professor Michael Useem, thank you for sharing such practical and inspiring insights on leadership. Your principles remind us that true leadership is about clarity, courage, and character, especially in times of uncertainty. It's been a true privilege to having you on the podcast. Thank you once again.
Deepak, thank you for bringing me on. And I want to extend to everybody who's been part of this webcast here. I want to extend the best for the exercise of your own leadership. We're all leaders. The future is bright, and I'm wishing you the best in stepping up to all the leadership callings that are entailed that we've been going through today and well beyond. So Deepak, a pleasure to work with you.
Thank you, Professor.